Jonas Cooper had not smiled in 11 years, and the citizens of Dust Creek, Texas, had long since stopped waiting for him to start. The year was 1878, and the land he owned stretched from the base of the red sandstone bluffs in the west all the way to the shallow bend of the Pecos River in the east. Nearly 14,000 acres of shortgrass prairie, cedar breaks, and dry creek beds that bloomed briefly and violently with wildflowers after a hard spring rain. It was the largest privately held ranch in all of Calder County, and it had taken Jonas Cooper exactly 20 years to build it from nothing. He had started at the age of 22 with 160 acres of rocky hardscrabble land he had purchased with money he earned working cattle drives up through the Indian Territory, sleeping under open sky and eating half-cooked salt pork beside rivers that smelled of mud and copper. He had been young then, and ambitious, and burning with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. He had wanted land. He had wanted permanence. He had wanted something that could not be taken from him the way everything else in his early life had been taken. So he had worked. He had worked when other men rested, and he had saved when other men spent, and he had negotiated, fiercely and quietly, for every parcel that bordered his own. He had purchased flooded bottomland cheap and drained it. He had bought burned grazing ground after a grass fire swept through, and waited 3 seasons for the grass to return. He had done all of it with a cold, precise determination that made other ranchers respect him and townspeople find him difficult to approach. He ran 600 head of longhorn cattle across his range, employed 11 cowboys and a cook, and operated his ranch, the Double C, like a man conducting a military campaign rather than building a home. The house itself was testament to this. It was large, well built of limestone and cedar, with a wide front porch that looked out over his land, and it was almost entirely without softness. There were no curtains in the windows. There were no flowers planted along the fence line. The kitchen table was long and functional, the chairs sturdy but plain, and the walls bore only a single framed survey map showing every acre he owned. He had a housekeeper named Mrs. Polly Briggs, a 62-year-old widow who came 3 times a week to cook and clean, and who had, on several occasions, gently suggested that the house could use a woman's touch. Jonas had looked at her each time with the same flat, unreadable expression and offered no response. He was 42 years old in the spring of 1878. He was not an unattractive man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same limestone as his house, and eyes the color of an overcast sky, gray and measuring and almost never warm. Women in Dust Creek had made attempts over the years. He had been polite and unmoved, and eventually the attempts had stopped. People said Jonas Cooper was married to his land, and they meant it both as a compliment and as an explanation for why he was so thoroughly, determinedly alone. He would not have disagreed with them. He did not think much about happiness as a concept. Happiness was something that belonged to people who had time for softness. What Jonas had was purpose, and he had told himself for 20 years that purpose was enough. That acreage was enough. That the sight of 600 cattle spread across pasture land he had bled for and bargained for, and occasionally fought for, was a sufficient substitute for whatever it was that made other men laugh at supper and reach for a woman's hand in the dark. It was enough, he told himself. It was always going to be enough. He had been telling himself that particular lie for so long that he had almost stopped being able to hear it as a lie at all. The morning Lydia Lockhart arrived in Dust Creek was the kind of morning that happened only in late April in southwest Texas. The air cool, and carrying the green smell of recent rain, the sky so blue it hurt to look at it directly, and the red dirt road still damp enough to hold the impression of wagon wheels in clear, sharp lines. The stage from San Angelo came through on Tuesdays, and on this particular Tuesday, Jonas had ridden into town to collect a shipment of fence wire from the general store, a task he had intended to accomplish in under 20 minutes. He was loading the last coil of wire onto his wagon when the stage rolled in. He paid it no particular attention. People came and went from Dust Creek, drummers selling goods, land agents sniffing around for opportunities, the occasional family passing through on their way further west. Jonas had learned long ago not to invest interest in people he had not specifically invited into his business, but something made him look up. Perhaps it was the way the stage driver's voice carried an unusual note of concern. Perhaps it was the clatter of the passenger door opening too quickly, urgently, and then the sound of a woman's voice clear and without tremor, despite what must have been a very long and exhausting journey. "I need to know where I can find the county land office," the voice said. "I was told it was on this street." Jonas straightened and turned. She was standing beside the stage with one hand gripping a worn leather traveling bag, and the other shading her eyes against the morning sun. She was medium height, with chestnut hair that had come partly loose from its pins during the journey and now fell in soft, unruly waves around a face that was, even in its current state of road-dusted exhaustion, remarkably composed. Her dress was plain but well-made, a dark blue broadcloth that had seen hard travel, and there were dust marks along the hem that told of a journey made on roads far less kind than the one she stood on now. She had brown eyes the color of good creek water over copper stones, warm and lit with intelligence, and underneath that, something that looked like the quiet, controlled kind of worry that a person carried when they were in genuine trouble and had decided not to show it. She looked to be in her early 30s. She was not looking at Jonas. She was looking at the general store owner's wife, who had come out onto the porch and was pointing down the street toward the land office. "Thank you," Lydia Lockhart said, and she meant it with her whole body. There was relief in the angle of her shoulders, a slight loosening around her mouth, and she turned and walked in the direction she had been pointed, with the kind of purposeful stride that told Jonas she had not come to Dust Creek by accident or whim. He watched her go for exactly 3 seconds longer than he should have, and then he gathered his reins and drove his wagon back toward the Double C, and told himself firmly that whoever that woman was, she had nothing to do with him. He was wrong, of course. He would discover exactly how wrong 3 days later. The land office in Dust Creek was operated by a man named Gerald Hatch, who was well suited to his profession, in that he had the precise combination of obsequiousness toward the powerful and cold indifference toward the vulnerable that bureaucratic power tends to produce in small men given significant authority. He was 51, thin, with small pale eyes and the habit of removing his glasses and cleaning them whenever he wished to avoid giving a direct answer to a direct question. Lydia Lockhart sat across from Gerald Hatch's desk on a wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap and her traveling bag beside her feet, and explained her situation with a clarity and steadiness that cost her considerably more effort than it appeared to. She had come to Dust Creek because of a deed. Specifically, because of a deed that had belonged to her father, Robert Lockhart, who had died the previous November from a fever, leaving behind 320 acres of land along the western edge of Calder County that had been in the family's name for 11 years. The land had a small house on it, a well, a modest kitchen garden, and 200 acres of decent grazing ground. It was not large by Texas standards, but it was hers by the terms of her father's will, which she had in her traveling bag along with the original deed, copies made by a San Angelo lawyer named Mr. Fenwick, and a letter from the county probate court confirming her inheritance. Gerald Hatch had removed his glasses and cleaned them 4 times during her explanation. "Miss Lockhart," he said when she finished, "there is a complication." "What kind of complication?" The land in question, the Lockhart parcel, sections 14 and 15, was sold. Lydia was very still. "It was not sold. My father died in November. He left the land to me." "Yes, well, there is a deed of sale on record dated December of last year, showing a transfer of title to Mr. Jonas Cooper of the Double C Ranch." Hatch put his glasses back on and looked at her over them with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and completely untroubled. Mr. Cooper acquired a number of parcels along that Western Ridge line last year. It was all quite properly recorded. It cannot have been properly recorded if my father was already dead when it was allegedly sold, Mr. Hatch, Lydia said, and her voice had dropped into something quiet and precise. A dead man cannot sell his land. Hatch cleaned his glasses again. These things can get complicated, Miss Lockhart. Perhaps the sale was arranged before your father's passing and only finalized. My father died November 3rd. The sale you're describing is dated December 14th. I want to see that document. Hatch hesitated long enough that Lydia knew, with a cold certainty that settled somewhere in the middle of her chest, that there was something wrong with it. He produced the document eventually, sliding it across the desk with the careful movements of a man who was not quite confident in what he was presenting, and Lydia looked at it for a long moment. The signature at the bottom, purporting to be Robert Lockhart's, was not her father's handwriting. She had grown up reading his letters. She knew the particular way he formed his capital letters, the slight leftward slant of his signature, the way he always underlined his last name in a habit she had teased him about since she was 12 years old. The signature on this document was a reasonable forgery, but it was still a forgery. "This is not my father's signature," she said. "Miss Lockhart, I'm not in a position to make that determination. Then I will find someone who is." She took back her own documents, folded them carefully, placed them in her bag, and stood. "I intend to speak with Mr. Cooper." Hatch looked genuinely alarmed for the first time. "Now, Miss Lockhart, there's no need to go stirring up. Good day, Mr. Hatch." She walked out into the April sunshine and stood for a moment on the board sidewalk with her hand flat against her traveling bag, taking a slow breath, letting herself feel, in private and briefly, the full weight of what she was facing. She had spent the last 5 months grieving her father, settling his affairs in San Angelo, gathering every document she could find, and traveling across difficult country to claim what was rightfully hers. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. She had almost nothing left in her purse. The world in 1878 was not a simple place for a woman attempting to assert a legal claim against a powerful landowner, and she knew it. But she was her father's daughter. Robert Lockhart had been a man who believed that honest, stubborn persistence could move most of the obstacles a person was likely to encounter in this life, and that the ones it couldn't move directly, it could find a way around. She asked at the livery stable for directions to the Double C Ranch, hired a horse for the afternoon. She was a competent rider. Her father had made sure of that, and set out along the red dirt road toward the western bluffs. Jonas Cooper was on horseback when she rode through the gate of the Double C. He was working with 2 of his cowboys to move a group of young steers from a holding pasture into a larger range field, and he had not noticed her approach until she was close enough that her arrival interrupted what he was doing. He turned his horse toward her with an expression that did not change, which in itself communicated a great deal. Up close, he was larger than she had estimated from her brief sight of him in town, broad and solid in the saddle, with the easy stillness of a man who had spent most of his adult life on horseback. His face was weathered and set with lines that came not from age alone but from years of looking into sun and wind without flinching. He was looking at her now with those gray eyes that held no particular welcome, though neither did they hold hostility. They held assessment. "Can I help you?" he said. "Mr. Cooper," Lydia said, and she was proud of the steadiness in her voice. "My name is Lydia Lockhart. Robert Lockhart was my father. I believe you're in possession of land that belongs to me." Something shifted in his eyes. Not guilt, she watched carefully for guilt, but something more complicated than she had expected. A slight tension around his jaw. A recognition that whatever she was here to say was not, to him, entirely news. "Ride up to the house," he said after a long moment. "I'll be there directly." It was not a warm invitation, but it was not a dismissal either. She rode up to the limestone house and dismounted at the hitching rail and stood looking at the wide front porch. Mrs. Polly Briggs appeared in the doorway, took one long look at Lydia, and immediately said, "Come inside and have some coffee, child. You look like you've ridden a hard road." Lydia, who had not been called child by anyone in years and who found it unexpectedly comforting, accepted both the invitation and the coffee. She was sitting at the long kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a tin mug when Jonas came in. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, poured himself coffee without asking, and sat down across from her. He looked at her steadily without speaking, and she recognized the tactic. She had used it herself when she needed someone else to fill a silence, so she didn't fill it. She waited. He was the one who spoke first. "Last December," he said, "I was approached by a man named Clement Hadley, who said he was acting as agent for the Lockhart estate. He told me Robert Lockhart was unable to manage his affairs due to serious illness and wished to sell the western parcel before he was no longer in a position to conduct business. He presented a signed deed of sale. I paid a fair price, $400. He paused. "I had not been told your father had died." Lydia listened to every word. She believed him not because he was asking her to, but because of the very specific, careful way he was telling the story. A man who had forged that document would not be providing details that helped her identify who had actually done it. He was giving her the name, Clement Hadley. "Do you know who Clement Hadley is?" she asked. "Land agent out of San Angelo. He's done business in this county before." Jonas was watching her with those gray eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something beneath the surface of his expression that she hadn't expected to find there. He was bothered by this. Genuinely, quietly bothered by it. Not in an agitated way, but in the way of a man who had very firm ideas about how things ought to be conducted and was recalibrating against new information. "The signature was convincing," he said, and it was the closest thing to an apology she was going to get from Jonas Cooper in that first conversation. "It was not my father's," she said. "I can prove that. I have letters, years of correspondence, his journal. The handwriting is distinct." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "You're saying you were defrauded of your inheritance." "I'm saying someone forged my father's name on a deed of sale 6 weeks after he died and sold land I am the rightful heir to, and that you purchased that land in good faith based on a fraudulent document." She held his gaze. "I don't believe you knew, but I need my land back, Mr. Cooper." There was a long silence. Outside, wind moved through the cedar trees along the fence line, and somewhere a cattle gate swung and clattered. Jonas Cooper set down his coffee mug. "All right," he said. Lydia waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. He had said all right with the same tone a man used when he had made a decision and had no intention of revisiting it. She searched his face for reluctance or calculation and found neither. "All right," he said again. "I'll ride into San Angelo with you and we'll sort this out properly." She had not expected that. She had arrived prepared for denial, or for legal threats, or for the kind of cold dismissal that powerful men in her experience reserved for women who challenged them on matters of property. She had not prepared herself for quiet, immediate agreement. "You would do that," she said. He looked at her as if the question was slightly strange. "I'm not in the business of holding land I don't have clean title to, Miss Lockhart. If that deed was fraudulent, then I don't actually own it. And if I don't own it, it's yours." He picked up his coffee again. "I'll want to contact the sheriff's office about Clement Hadley, too. What he did is a crime." Lydia Lockhart sat back slightly in her chair. She was aware of an unfamiliar sensation, something that might have been, if she thought about it carefully, the release of a tension she had been carrying since before she had even left San Angelo. She had prepared so thoroughly for a fight. She had not prepared for a man who simply looked at a situation, determined what was right, and chose it. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the same whole-body way she had meant the thank you to the storekeeper's wife, but deeper. He nodded once and stood. "You'll want a room for the night. Mrs. Briggs can set you up in the east guest room. We can leave for San Angelo the day after tomorrow. I have some business here tomorrow that can't wait. I can make arrangements in town. It's a 20-mile ride from town to San Angelo, he said. There's no good reason for you to ride back to town and then turn around again in the morning. It was entirely practical. There was nothing in the way he said it that was forward or improper. It was simply a logical arrangement stated by a man who thought in terms of logistics. And yet, as Polly Briggs showed Lydia to the east guest room, the older woman caught Lydia's eye and smiled at her with a private, soft satisfaction that Lydia could not quite interpret. She was very tired. She washed the road dust from her face and hands at the basin, sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into late afternoon, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, a cowboy's voice calling something across the yard. She had expected to feel adrift and alone in this place. Instead, she felt in the most inexplicable way as though she had arrived somewhere. She did not examine that feeling too closely. Not yet. Dinner at the Double C was a practical affair. Polly set a large table with beans and beef and cornbread and strong coffee, and Jonas's 3 cowboys who lived in the bunkhouse came in for the meal along with Jonas himself. The cowboys were respectful and somewhat tongue-tied in Lydia's presence. She suspected it had been a long time since a woman had sat at this table at dinner, if it had ever happened at all. There was a young cowboy named Sam who could not have been older than 20, and who turned a significant shade of red every time Lydia passed him the bread. Jonas ate in his characteristic way, efficiently, without much conversation, but Lydia noticed that he was not entirely silent in her presence. He asked her about the road from San Angelo. He asked once about her father, and when she described Robert Lockhart, his intelligence and his humor, and the way he could find a useful thing to say about any piece of land you showed him, no matter how poor, Jonas listened with an attention that went beyond politeness. After dinner, when Polly had cleared the table and the cowboys had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had grown quiet, Jonas poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of Lydia and sat down with the other. He was a good man, Jonas said. He was the best man I knew, Lydia said simply. Jonas looked at his coffee. How long did you care for him before he died? 2 years. The illness came on slowly at first and then quickly at the end. She looked at her own hands, wrapped around the mug. He left the land to me because he knew I wanted to work it. I had plans for it, not cattle. I don't have the resources for a cattle operation, but I know something about horses. I thought I could breed working horses, quarter horses. There's good grazing and the well is reliable. She paused, half expecting him to look at her with the particular kind of condescension that people sometimes directed at women who spoke about land and livestock, as though they actually knew what they were talking about. He did not look at her that way. He looked at her with those measuring gray eyes, and after a moment he said, "The grazing on the western ridge is some of the best in the county. Your father was a good judge of land." It was the right thing to say, not complimentary of her specifically, just honest and factual and respectful of her father's judgment. She found it more comforting than a dozen polished compliments would have been. "What made you want land?" she asked. It was forward, perhaps, but she was tired enough that her guard had dropped a fraction and the question had simply come out. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I grew up without it." He did not elaborate, and she did not push him. But something passed between them in that kitchen, some small, careful thing, like 2 people discovering they could occupy the same quiet without it becoming uncomfortable. She went to bed and slept better than she had in months. The following day, Lydia was not idle. She was not the kind of woman who could sit in a borrowed room and wait for other people to conduct her affairs. She spent the morning with Polly Briggs, who was, beneath her domestic efficiency, a sharply observant woman with strong opinions she was happy to share. Polly had been the Double C's housekeeper for 7 years, and had watched Jonas Cooper accumulate land and property, with an admiration for his capability and a frank sadness about his emptiness that she expressed without much subtlety. "He runs this place like it's a business he has to win," Polly told Lydia, as they worked together in the kitchen garden, turning the soil for spring planting. Lydia had offered to help because she was genuinely restless and because she liked kitchens and gardens and the straightforward satisfaction of useful work. "And it's a fine business, no argument there, but a man needs more than land to come home to." "He seems to manage well enough," Lydia said carefully. "Managing is not the same as living," Polly said, and drove her trowel into the earth with a certainty that suggested this observation was not up for debate. In the afternoon, Lydia rode out toward the western edge of the property. Not far, just along the fence line she could see from the yard, and looked at the land. She had not seen the Lockhart parcel yet, but she could see where the double C boundary ended, and where, beyond a cedar break, the red earth of the ridge began its rise. It was beautiful country in the particular, unsentimental way of South Texas, not gentle or forgiving, but honest. The grass moved in the wind with a sound like distant water. A pair of red-tailed hawks were working the thermals above the bluff. She did not notice Jonas until his horse was alongside hers, and even then he made no sound to announce himself. He simply appeared, the way a man does when he has spent his whole life moving through open country. "That's your father's eastern fence line," he said, nodding toward the cedar break. "I know," she said. "I've studied the survey maps." He glanced at her with something that might have been approval. "The quarter horse idea is a good one," he said after a moment. "There's a market for them. I use working horses myself. I've been buying from a man in Abilene, but the stock isn't what it could be." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the ridge line, not at her, with the focused, steady way he seemed to look at everything. The afternoon light was doing something golden and unreasonable to the side of his face, and she made a deliberate effort not to notice. "Are you telling me there would be a market for what I'm proposing?" she said. "I'm telling you what I know about the market," he said. "What you do with it is your business." They rode back toward the house in a silence that was, she realized, entirely comfortable. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of people who don't feel the need to fill the air with noise just to prove they're present. She thought, with a slight, unsettling jolt that she did not particularly welcome, that she had not felt comfortable in the silence of another person's company since her father had been well. They left for San Angelo the next morning at first light, Jonas and Lydia and one of his cowboys, a steady, quiet man named Tom, who rode a respectful distance behind them and kept his counsel. The road to San Angelo was 20 miles of red dirt and shortgrass, crossing two dry creek beds that were running clear and shallow from the recent rain, cutting through a stretch of mesquite country that smelled of honey and dust. They talked on the road. Not constantly, but in the easy way of people who have established that silences between them are not threatening. Lydia told him about San Angelo, about the years she had spent there keeping house for her father and making quiet plans for the future. She had never married. There had been a man once, years ago, a decent man named William who had gone west before she was ready to follow and had not written after the first year, and she had filed that experience under things that had happened and were finished and thought about it rarely. She did not tell Jonas all of this in any direct way, but it came through in pieces, the way a life does when two people are talking about other things. Jonas told her almost nothing of himself directly. But she was a good listener, and she was beginning to understand the language of his ellipses, the things he said adjacent to the things he meant. He had come to Texas from Missouri at the age of 22. He did not speak of his family there. He spoke of the first cattle drive he had worked with an almost imperceptible warmth, the Kishom Trail, long days in the saddle, the sound of 3,000 cattle at rest in the dark. There had been something alive in him then, she gathered, some forward-looking brightness that had existed before the land acquiring had become a project unto itself and quietly consumed everything else. "Did you ever enjoy it?" she asked at one point, surprising herself. The acquiring. He rode for 100 yards before answering. The first 100 acres, yes. After that it was more necessary, like building a fence. You build it to the corner and then you just keep building because there's still open ground. But the fence doesn't make you happy, she said. He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone at a distance could have read, but she was close enough to see it. A slight opening, like a door moving on its hinge without quite reaching the wall. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They arrived in San Angelo by mid-morning and went directly to the office of Mr. Fenwick, the lawyer Lydia had previously consulted, who had been expecting her. Jonas introduced himself with the compact efficiency of a man who understood that his name and reputation carried weight in these parts, and used that weight quietly and without ostentation. He laid out the situation clearly: the fraudulent deed, the name of Clement Hadley, the fact that he had paid money in good faith for land he was now prepared to acknowledge as belonging to the woman sitting beside him. Mr. Fenwick, who was a thin, precise man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, listened carefully and made notes, and expressed the particular professional admiration of a lawyer who encounters a client situation that is morally clear even while being legally complicated. "The forgery can be proven," he said, setting Lydia's document collection beside the fraudulent deed. "Any competent handwriting comparison will settle that. The question is where Clement Hadley is currently." "I know where Hadley operates," Jonas said. "I'll speak to the sheriff." The afternoon was spent in the orderly, painstaking work of legal reclamation. Jonas spoke to the county sheriff, a rangy Texan named Beaumont, with a directness and certainty that brooked no delaying tactics. Lydia presented her documents. The handwriting comparison was performed by the county clerk, who had been presented with enough of Robert Lockhart's correspondence to make the forgery unambiguous. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the fraudulent deed had been formally flagged for cancellation. A warrant had been issued for Clement Hadley's arrest, and paperwork was in process to restore clear title to the Lockhart parcel to Lydia. The return of the $400 Jonas had paid to Hadley was a matter for the courts once Hadley was found, but Jonas had indicated, briefly and without drama, that this was Hadley's problem to solve and not Lydia's concern. They were standing outside the lawyer's office in the late afternoon gold of the San Angelo street when Lydia turned to Jonas and found, for the first time, that she had no measured, careful words prepared. Everything she had intended to say, the proper, composed thank you, the acknowledgement of his assistance, the professional appreciation, seemed entirely inadequate for what he had actually done, which was to immediately and without resistance surrender a piece of his own property, ride 20 miles to make it official, and use his influence and name to cut through legal complications that could have taken her months to resolve alone. "I don't know how to properly thank you for this," she said. "Then don't," he said, with the simplicity of a man who found expressions of gratitude more uncomfortable than the actions that warranted them. He said it without coldness, just plainly. And then, because he was Jonas Cooper, and he was not accustomed to the feeling of wanting to extend a conversation past its practical conclusion, and did not quite know what to do with that desire, he said, "Are you hungry? There's a decent restaurant near the livery." It was not, by any standard of romantic overture, a sweeping gesture. It was the suggestion of a meal in a practical tone. And yet Lydia Lockhart found herself smiling, a full, genuine, unguarded smile, for the first time in a very long time, and said yes. Over beef stew and good bread in a San Angelo restaurant with checked tablecloths and a tin ceiling, they talked for 2 hours. Properly talked, not the careful adjacent language of two strangers on a road, but the real conversation of two people who are, against the expectations of both, finding each other genuinely interesting. They talked about horses and land and the particular nature of South Texas country and what it did to people who chose to make their lives there. They talked about Robert Lockhart's theory of land. That land was not something to be conquered or accumulated, but to be understood, to learn to read the way you learn to read a person, with patience and attention and respect for what it was trying to tell you. Jonas listened to this with his elbows on the table and his coffee gone cold beside him, and when she finished he said, quietly, "Your father sounds like he was the kind of man I should have known." "He would have liked you," Lydia said, and she believed it. Her father had always had an instinct for people who were fundamentally honest, however much those people had armored themselves against the world. He would have seen Jonas Cooper in the first 10 minutes and recognized something worthwhile under the granite. Jonas looked at her with those gray eyes. The restaurant was warm and the evening light was coming through the windows at a low, amber angle and catching in her hair where it had come loose again at the temple, and he was, she realized, doing what she was doing looking too long. They both looked away at the same moment. The ride back to the Double C the next morning was different. Something had shifted between them the previous evening, some small but meaningful alteration in the way the space between two people feels when they have spent time together and allowed themselves to be, for a few hours, honestly themselves. Lydia was aware of it in a way that she tried to keep from becoming too visible on her face with partial success. Jonas was quiet but differently quiet than before, less sealed. There was an occasional sideways glance that she would not have attributed to him 2 days ago. They arrived back at the ranch in early afternoon. Tom took their horses. Polly met them at the door with coffee and the look of a woman who is collecting information about multiple things simultaneously. "All sorted," Polly said. "All sorted," Jonas confirmed. Polly looked between them with her assessor's eyes. "Good," she said, with a satisfaction that had nothing specific to point to and yet was entirely legible. The legal paperwork would take 10 days to finalize. Mr. Fenwick had said he would send word when the title transfer was complete and Lydia could formally take possession of the Lockhart parcel. In the meantime, there was the practical matter of what she was to do, where she was to stay. She could go back to town. She could find a boarding house for the 10 days. It was the sensible, proper, self-sufficient thing to do. It was Jonas who, in his direct and entirely unsentimental way, said, "There's no need for you to stay in town. The guest room is comfortable. The ride to your land is shorter from here." He said it to the fireplace, not to her, and then he picked up his hat and went back outside, and Polly Briggs made a small sound in her throat that was definitely a suppressed smile. Lydia stayed. The 10 days that followed were the most confusing and illuminating and unexpectedly glad days Jonas Cooper had experienced in a span of time he could not precisely measure. He was not accustomed to having someone in the house who occupied space differently than Mrs. Briggs, differently than any person he could remember sharing close quarters with. Lydia was not loud or intrusive or demanding. She was simply present in a way that he was not accustomed to and which, to his significant bewilderment, he found himself not wanting to be without. She rose early and worked. She helped Polly in the house without being asked, and without making it seem like a statement about how the house needed help. She went to her father's land every second day on a borrowed horse, and walked the fence lines and made notes in a small journal she carried, and came back with red dirt on her boots, and her hair escaped from its pins, and her eyes bright with the particular light that comes from seeing possibilities in a piece of ground. She asked Jonas questions that no one ever asked him. Not about the ranch, though she asked about that too, and with a genuine intelligence that he respected. She asked about what he had read. There were books on the shelf in his study that had been there for years, some of them barely touched, and about what he thought about things. She asked about the land not as acreage but as country. What was it like here in January? Where did the water go in a dry summer? Where did the pronghorn come through in the fall? She asked these things the way she looked at land with attention, as though what he had to say was worth learning. He was 42 years old and he had, without ever quite noticing it happening, arrived at a life that was full of things and empty of people who were genuinely interested in what he thought. His cowboys respected him and obeyed him. Polly took care of him with a comfortable, fond efficiency. The businessmen he dealt with wanted things from him. No one had asked Jonas Cooper what he thought about January in South Texas since he could not remember when. He answered her questions. Slowly at first, in the spare, compressed way he spoke, but gradually with more length, more detail, as though something was being allowed to run that had been very tightly controlled for a long time. On the 5th day, he took her to a place he had never taken anyone. He could not have explained afterward why he did it. He had simply found himself, at the end of a morning's work, riding toward the north section of his land where a limestone bluff overlooked a wide valley, and noticed that he wanted to share it with someone, and that the someone in question was Lydia, and that this desire was entirely new and entirely his. He found her at the kitchen garden and said, with his characteristic lack of preamble, "Come and see something." She came. The place was a ledge of flat rock at the top of the north bluff, looking out over the valley where the Pecos made its slow bend, with the whole of his land and hers spread below, and the mountains a faint purple suggestion on the horizon. In the afternoon light, the valley was extraordinary, the river silver bright, the grass gold green, the shadows of the clouds moving over it like slow, dark ships. Lydia stood at the edge of the rock and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He stood beside her and said nothing, which was fine because this particular place did not require commentary. "You come here?" she asked eventually. "Sometimes. By yourself?" "Yes." She turned to look at him, and there was a question in her eyes that she did not put into words, but he heard it anyway. "Why are you showing me something you've only ever kept for yourself?" And he had no ready answer. He looked away from her eyes because they made him feel transparent in a way he had not felt in a very long time, and he looked at the valley instead. "It's the most beautiful thing I've seen in Texas," she said softly. "Yes," he said, and he was not looking at the valley when he said it. She heard the shift in his voice. He saw her hear it. A silence settled between them that was charged with something neither of them had named or moved toward, and which both of them felt as a kind of held breath. He did not reach for her hand. He was not, by nature or habit, a man who reached, but something in him was rearranging. He could feel it, the slow internal movement of things that have been in a fixed position for a very long time beginning to shift their weight. He had spent 20 years building something that was objectively impressive and privately meaningless, and standing on this bluff in the spring afternoon he was, for the first time, capable of asking himself honestly whether he had been building in the right direction. It was Polly who, on the 7th day, stated the obvious. She waited until Lydia had gone to bed, and Jonas was sitting at the kitchen table with the day's accounts and his cold coffee, and she put a fresh cup in front of him and sat down across from him in the way she only did when she had something to say. "That woman," Polly said, "is the finest thing that has happened to this house since I started working in it." Jonas kept his eyes on his accounts. "She's a guest." "She is going to be leaving in 3 days," Polly said, "and then this place is going back to being what it was, and I want you to think very carefully about whether that is acceptable to you." "Polly, I am 62 years old and I have run out of patience for watching you be alone when you don't have to be." She stood up, smoothed her apron, and delivered her final observation with the precision of a woman who had been composing it for days. "She lights up when you walk into a room, Jonas, and the very sad thing is that you do too, and you're the only one who hasn't noticed it." She went to bed and left him alone with his accounts and his coffee and the sound of the wind against the window panes. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in the dark and thought with unusual honesty about the last 7 days, about the way the house felt different, about the way meals had acquired a quality they had not had before, not the food, the company, about the bluff and what he had said without saying it, and the way she had heard it and not looked away. He thought about 20 years of land acquisition, the maps on his study wall that showed the growth of what he owned in careful surveyor's lines. He thought about the morning he had ridden to his highest fence line and looked over his whole property and felt nothing particular. Pride, perhaps, in the abstract, qualified sense, but not joy. Not the warm, specific, answering joy that came from something that was alive and present and mattered, because it mattered to someone else as well. He got up before dawn, saddled his horse in the gray pre-light, and rode to the North Bluff by himself. He sat on the flat rock and watched the sky change from black to deep blue to the first thin gold line at the horizon. He thought about what he had and what he was missing, and what, at 42, a man was supposed to do when he discovered that the life he had built, for all its visible success, was missing the one thing that made a life worth keeping. He rode back as the sun came full over the ridge, and the ranch was waking up around him, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney was going straight up in the still morning air, and he felt something that he had not felt in so long that he almost did not recognize it. He felt, tentatively and with some residual wariness, hope. On the 8th day, he found Lydia at the fence line of her father's land. She was standing with her journal open in her hand, looking at the eastern pasture with the focused, quiet concentration she gave to things she was actively planning. Her horse was tied to the cedar post behind her. She heard him coming and turned, and the morning light caught her face, and she looked glad to see him, simply, directly, openly glad in the way of a person who is not attempting to disguise what she feels. He dismounted. He stood beside her at the fence and looked at the pasture. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, the horse breeding." Yes, she was looking at the side of his face with that attentive quality she had. "I have 2 breeding mares I've been meaning to do something useful with. Good quarter horse blood. If you were to establish a breeding operation here, it would make practical sense to start with solid stock." He said this to the fence post. "I would be willing to loan them to start the operation." She was quiet for a moment. "Jonas." He turned to look at her. It was the first time she had used his first name, and it did something to the air between them. "Are you offering to help me because it's a good business arrangement?" she said slowly. "Or because," she stopped herself, recalibrated, started again. "Why are you offering to help me?" He held her gaze. This was the moment. Not the bluff, not the dinners, not the careful adjacent conversations on the road, but this moment, when she was asking him a direct question, and he had the choice to retreat into logistics or to say something true. "Because I want you to stay," he said. It was very quiet. A sissortail flycatcher was calling somewhere in the cedar trees, and the morning air smelled of grass and damp red earth, and everything was very still. "In Dusk Creek," she said, and there was a carefulness in her voice, a precise kind of carefulness that came from wanting very much to be sure she had heard correctly. "Near enough," he said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched the thoughts move through her expression, not confusion, but the careful, unhurried consideration of a woman who had learned not to rush toward things without understanding them. He respected this. He would have worried about her if she had simply said yes without thinking. "I have been thinking about staying," she said at last. "I want to work this land. I want to build something here." She looked back at the pasture. "I came here to reclaim something that was taken, and I found more than I expected to find." "What did you find?" he said, and his voice was quieter than he had intended. She looked at him again, and the carefulness had shifted into something that was not careful at all, that was open and warm and entirely honest. "Someone who sees things the way my father saw them," she said. "Someone who is honest in the way that matters." She paused. "Someone I did not expect." He took one step toward her. Not far. There was still a proper distance between them, still the full, appropriate air of 1878 propriety. But it was a step toward rather than the habitual sideways posture of a man who has made a practice of maintaining distance between himself and the things he wanted. "I have been building things for 20 years and none of it," he said slowly, as though he were reading something aloud that he had only just managed to decipher. "None of it ever felt like it was worth arriving home to, until you were in it." She was very still. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light. "I have not been particularly practiced at this," he said, with a roughness in his voice that came from the effort of saying something he had not said before and did not have a rehearsed way of saying. "At wanting a person to stay, but I want you to stay, Lydia. I am asking you as clearly as I know how to ask to consider—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I'm not finished. I know what you're asking," she said. "And yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something extraordinary happened to his face. It happened slowly, as though the muscles had not used this particular arrangement in a very long time and needed a moment to remember how. But it arrived, complete and unambiguous, and entirely unlike the flat expression that Dusk Creek had learned to accept as Jonas Cooper's resting state. He smiled. It was not a small smile. It transformed him, took the granite and the weather lines and the 20 years of deliberate solitude and revealed, underneath all of it, the 22-year-old who had stood on 160 acres of rocky ground and felt the whole future opening ahead of him like good grass after rain. He looked younger and taller and more like himself in that moment than he had looked in years, and Lydia, watching it happen, felt something certain and warm settle into place in the center of her chest, and knew it was going to stay there. He reached out and took her hand, her right hand, which was holding the journal and which she surrendered without protest, and held it with a kind of careful, wondering firmness. And they stood there at the fence line of her father's land in the April morning, and neither of them felt any need to say anything else. Clement Hadley was arrested 2 weeks later in a town 80 miles south of San Angelo, found in the company of another land agent with whom he had been conducting similar fraudulent transactions. The warrant Jonas had helped set in motion had been efficient. Hadley was brought before the Calder County Court in May, and the combination of the handwriting evidence and the testimony of Jonas Cooper, who was not a man the court found easy to discount, resulted in Hadley's conviction on charges of fraud and forgery. The $400 Jonas had paid was attached as part of the judgment, though given the state of Hadley's finances it was unlikely to be fully recovered. Jonas had already said this was not important. He said it with the simple finality of a man for whom $400, while not nothing, was not the thing he cared about recovering. The title to the Lockhart parcel was formally restored to Lydia Margaret Lockhart in May of 1878, witnessed by Mr. Fenwick, and filed with the Calder County Land Office by a Gerald Hatch who was, for the first time in Lydia's experience of him, unable to maintain his customary obsequious indifference, and could not look directly at Jonas Cooper at all. She took possession of her land on a May morning that was warm and bright, standing at the gate of the small house, which needed work. The winter had been hard with Jonas beside her. He had said, the previous week, that he would like to help her make the house livable again. He had said it with the same practical tone he used for all significant gestures, and she had heard it clearly for what it was, which was a man who had decided to build something in a new direction, and was doing it the only way he knew how, with concrete, visible, useful effort. She held the gate open and walked through and stood on the front step of the house that her father had built, and thought about Robert Lockhart and what he would have made of all this. She thought he would have been very pleased. She thought he might have recognized Jonas Cooper as the kind of man he had always hoped she would find difficult at first acquaintance and worth every bit of difficulty once you got through the surface and found what was underneath. "It needs a new roof section on the west end," Jonas said, walking the perimeter with his eyes on the structure. He had brought 2 of his cowboys to help. "I know," she said. "The well looks sound. I'll have Sam check the pump." "Jonas," he stopped his assessment. "Yes." She walked to where he was standing and took his hand and looked up at him with the honest, warm directness that she had offered him from almost the first day in which he was, slowly and with a particular wondering gratitude, learning to receive without retreating. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He turned his hand to hold hers properly. "I should be thanking you," he said. "For what?" He thought about the North Bluff at dawn, and the meals at the long table and Polly's declaration, and the morning at this fence line, when he had made himself say what was true. He thought about 20 years of a life that had been impressively large and deeply quiet, and the woman standing in front of him who had arrived in Dusk Creek in a road-dusted dress with a traveling bag and a claim, and had, in 10 days, rearranged everything he thought he knew about what he was building. For showing up, he said. It was insufficient. It was also, in the particular private language they were developing, entirely enough. The summer of 1878 was the fullest summer Jonas Cooper could remember in his adult life. Lydia moved into her father's house at the end of May, after 3 weeks of repairs in which Jonas, Sam, and the cowboy Tom had replaced the damaged roof section, reseeded the porch steps, and cleared the winter debris from the kitchen garden. Lydia had directed all of this with capable, cheerful authority, and had also done a significant portion of the actual work, which Sam found unprecedented and admirable and Jonas found entirely predictable and right. They called on each other every second or third day. This was proper and correct by the standards of the time and place, and both of them understood it as such, and also both of them were aware that what was proper and what they felt were operating on somewhat different schedules. Jonas rode over with fence wire or extra seed or a book from his study that he thought she might like, and he stayed for coffee and conversation, and sometimes for supper when Lydia made it clear she had cooked enough for 2. She came to the Double C on the days when Polly needed extra hands, and on the days when Jonas had a matter of ranch business he wanted to talk through with someone whose judgment he respected, which was increasingly frequent. Polly watched all of this with the satisfaction of a woman whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed by events, and said nothing further on the subject, having said everything she needed to say already. The 2 mares Jonas had loaned arrived at the Lockhart place in June, and Lydia went to work on the beginning of her breeding operation with a focused energy that Jonas found, privately, one of the most attractive things he had ever watched. She knew horses. She knew them the way he knew land, not as commodities but as individuals with specific qualities and tendencies, worth understanding on their own terms. She named the mares Pearl and Cedar, and handled them with a quiet confidence that immediately communicated itself to the animals. Within 2 weeks she had them settled, and she had also arranged, through a contact in San Angelo who bred quality stallions, for the particular stud service she needed to begin her program. By July she had 3 mares in foal, and a plan for the coming year that she had drawn up in her small journal, and that Jonas had studied with genuine admiration. She had a mind for the long term that matched his own, and where he tended to think in terms of acres and resource management she thought in terms of bloodlines and conformation, and the specific qualities that made a working horse exceptional. They complemented each other in this and in other things, and both of them knew it. One evening in late July, Jonas arrived at the Lockhart place with a loaf of bread Polly had sent and found Lydia sitting on the front porch in the last light, reading. She had a lamp beside her, though the dusk had not yet made it necessary, and she had her hair down, not loosened by wind and travel this time, but simply and deliberately down, the way it would be only in the privacy of her own home. She looked up when he rode in and smiled, and he thought, as he had been thinking with increasing frequency, about how this life looked with her in it, and how clearly he could see that he wanted it to look like this always. He tied his horse and sat on the porch step, which he had done before, and they talked about the foals and his latest fence expansion, and a letter she had received from her father's sister in Virginia. And after a while the talk slowed to comfortable silence, and the stars came out, and the lamp on the porch threw a warm circle of light around them. "Lydia," he said. She turned from looking at the sky. In the lamplight her face was warm and her eyes were soft, and she was looking at him with an unguarded attentiveness that made something in him simply and completely certain. "I want to ask you something properly," he said, "not in the middle of something else, not as a practical arrangement." "Properly?" She set her book down. She was very still. "I am not a simple man to know," he said. I am aware of this. I have spent a long time living in a way that did not allow for much in the way of he stopped, because the words he had planned were inadequate and tried again with plainer ones. I have been alone for a long time, and I had convinced myself that this was how my life was, and that it was sufficient. Then you came here and you were not what I planned for, and you changed what I thought was sufficient into something that looked like a great deal less than sufficient, quite quickly. He looked at her directly, the way she had always looked at him, and held it. I would like to marry you if you will have me. I would like you to come home to the Double C and make it what it should always have been, not mine, but ours. I would like to spend whatever time I have being a man who is building something for reasons that are worth the building. The lamp made a small sound in a gust of evening breeze. Jonas, she said softly, and the way she said his name was everything. Yes, she said. He exhaled very slowly, as though he had been holding that breath since April. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, not an extravagant ring, but a good one, simple and honest. A thin gold band with a small pale stone, which he had ridden to San Angelo to purchase 3 weeks ago and had been carrying since, waiting for the right moment. He held it out to her with a steadiness that cost him something, and she took it from him with both hands and looked at it and then looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that told him she was, with great effort, keeping something contained that wanted very much to be expressed all at once. He took the ring from her hands and she extended her left hand and he placed the ring on her finger, and she looked at it there in the lamplight for a long moment. And then she stood up from her chair and he stood from the step, and she simply put her arms around him, which was not what he had expected, and which undid him entirely. He stood there on her father's porch in the July night with his arms around Lydia Lockhart and his face against her hair, and the stars were out over the South Texas sky, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and the whole of what he had spent 20 years building was there in the dark around them. And for the first time in those 20 years, it meant exactly what he had always, underneath everything, wanted it to mean. It meant home. It meant hers as well as his. It meant the difference, finally understood, between accumulation and joy. They were married in September of 1878 at the small church in Dusk Creek, which was not large but which was, on that particular Saturday morning, entirely full. The town had an opinion about Jonas Cooper, and the opinion was that whatever was happening to him, whatever this woman had done to the geometry of his expression, and the way he moved through the world was a good development, and they wished it well. Old Mrs. Pierce, who ran the dry goods store and had known Jonas since he first arrived in the county 20 years ago, told anyone who would listen that she had always believed there was something warm underneath that man, and that she was glad someone had finally found it. Lydia wore a dress of ivory cotton that Polly had helped her make, with small pearl buttons up the front, and her chestnut hair pinned up properly, but for the inevitable strand at the left temple that simply refused to remain in place. She walked to the front of that church with the same steadiness she walked everywhere, not trembling, not anxious, but lit from inside with a clear, warm certainty that turned heads as she moved down the aisle. Jonas was waiting at the front with the composed face he showed the world, but his hands were absolutely still when he took hers, and the composure broke entirely for one undefended moment when she reached him and looked up at him. And the smile that came over him, the real one, the one that took years off him, was so evident and open that there was an audible collective sound from the assembled witnesses that was half laughter and entirely tender. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony with simple, genuine words. Jonas said his vows in the quiet, measured way he said everything, but with an undercurrent of feeling that Lydia heard clearly. Lydia said hers in a voice that was steady and warm and absolutely certain. The Reverend said the words that made it official, and Jonas looked at his wife. The word formed in his mind with the quality of something he had not known he needed until he had it, and took her face in his hands with a careful tenderness that was the most public and unguarded thing anyone in Dusk Creek had ever seen Jonas Cooper do, and kissed her, and everyone in the church made the sound again, less contained this time. The celebration after was held at the Double C, where Polly had spent the previous 2 days producing enough food to provision a cattle drive, and where Jonas's cowboys had hung lanterns along the porch rail and the cedar fence line, so that by evening the whole yard was lit with small, warm lights against the September dusk. There was fiddle music from a man named Hector who played in town on Saturday nights and who took the invitation to play at the Cooper wedding as one of the more prestigious engagements of his career. Jonas danced. This was a fact that caused significant comment among people who had known him for years, because Jonas Cooper dancing was something approximately as expected as a stone deciding to become a creek. He danced with Lydia in the lamplight on his own porch, and he was not graceful, but he was sincere, and he was attentive, and he held her as though she were something he intended to keep, and she laughed at his particular rigid interpretation of the fiddle's rhythm, and he pulled her closer in response, and the sound of her laughter in his arms was something he stored away in a part of himself that had been empty for a very long time. They moved Lydia's things to the Double C the following week. Not everything. The Lockhart house remained in her name and in good order, because the horse breeding operation was centered there and would remain so. But the Double C was home now, and she set about making it feel like one with a quiet, purposeful determination that Polly found deeply satisfying. Curtains appeared in the windows, not fussy ones, but good sturdy cotton in a deep gold that caught the afternoon light well. A kitchen garden was planted along the south side of the house, more ambitious than the one Polly had maintained. Lydia brought 3 of her father's books to the study and placed them on Jonas's shelf alongside his, and there was something about that small act, the mixture of his books and hers on the same shelf, as though they had always been part of the same library, that Jonas looked at on the first morning and felt, somewhere behind his sternum, a quiet and powerful ache of gratitude. He told her. He was not, by nature, a man who narrated his feelings as they happened, but he was learning, had been learning since April, since the fence-line conversation, since the bluff that Lydia did not need him to become someone else. She needed him to say the true things, however plainly, rather than to leave them unsaid and expect her to find them on her own. So he told her what it meant, the books on the shelf, and she listened to him with her characteristic full attention, and then she said simply, "Tell me things like that when you notice them, Jonas. I want to know what you see." He practiced this. It was not easy and it was not always fluent, but it was sincere, and sincerity, he was learning, was the currency she valued most. The autumn of 1878 settled over the Double C like the best kind of season, cool and golden and full of work that meant something. The cattle were in good condition. Lydia's first foals, born in the early autumn from the mares she had put in foal in the summer, were excellent, strong and straight-legged, and showing the quality she had been aiming for. Jonas watched her in the foaling barn one September night, crouched beside a newborn foal with her sleeves rolled up and her hair damp and her face concentrated and glad, and he thought, with a precision he had not felt about anything that was not land-related in 20 years, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. She noticed him watching and looked up and said, "Come and see him," with the same open gladness she had shown since April, and he went in and crouched beside her in the straw and looked at the damp, searching, big-eyed creature his wife was tending, and felt something so clear and uncomplicated that it took him a moment to identify it as happiness. Just that, happiness, not satisfaction, not accomplishment, not the measured gratification of a goal achieved. Just the warm, present, immediate happiness of being in this place with this person, beside this small wet creature finding its legs, with the smell of straw and rain and horse in the cool autumn dark. "He's going to be a good one," Lydia said, running her hands along the foal's legs with a practiced assessment. "Yes," Jonas said. He was looking at her. She smiled without looking up because she had learned to hear the particular quality in his voice when what he was saying and what he meant were two different things, and she liked it. She liked it very much. That November, Lydia told Jonas she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, across the table from each other with the coffee between them and the early winter light coming gray and clear through the new curtains. She told him plainly, the way she said everything, watching his face with her direct, warm eyes. He was very still for a moment. Then he put down his coffee cup, stood up, came around the table, and simply held her, the way he had held her on her father's porch in July, with his face against her hair and his arms steady and sure. And she could feel the particular quality in his arms that was different from his usual steadiness. Something opened in him when he held her. Something that had been working its way open since April and was now, in this kitchen in November, fully and completely without reservation. "Good," he said, against her hair, which was so magnificently insufficient and so entirely Jonah's that she laughed, and he held her tighter, and outside the first thin snow of the season was coming down on the red earth of the double sea. The boy was born in July of 1879. On a day when the South Texas heat was fierce, and the whole world smelled of dry grass and hot stone, and Jonas Cooper sat in the hallway of his limestone house and waited with a patience that was entirely manufactured. Underneath it, he was more afraid than he had been of anything since he could remember. And when the doctor came out and told him his wife was well and his son was here, something happened to Jonas Cooper's face that Polly Briggs, watching from the kitchen doorway, would describe to people for the rest of her life as the most complete and total transformation of a human face she had ever witnessed. He walked into the room and Lydia was sitting up against the pillows, tired and brilliant and real, holding a small and loudly opinionated bundle, and she looked at Jonas with her eyes full and her face stripped of everything except the most honest love and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the boy in his arms, and he held him with the same careful steadiness with which he held everything he cared about, and looked at this creature, red-faced and indignant and small-fisted, and entirely new and understood, with a sudden and total clarity that reorganized everything. Why, none of it had been enough before. Not the land, not the house, not the cattle, not the 14,000 acres of South Texas that his name was on. Not because those things were not real or not worth having, but because they had been assembled in the wrong order. He had been building the frame of a life for 20 years and wondering why it felt like nothing, not understanding that the frame is not the life. The life is the people in it. They named the boy Robert for Lydia's father. Jonas had suggested it without prompting, on the second night after his birth, when Lydia was nursing him in the quiet of their bedroom, and Jonas was watching them both with the new, still somewhat astonished look he had worn consistently since the boy's arrival. He said, "I'd like to call him Robert if you'd have that." And Lydia had looked at him over the baby's head and said nothing for a moment, and then she had pressed her lips together and nodded, and he had understood that she was containing something large and grateful, and he had moved to sit beside her on the bed, and she had leaned against him, and they had sat there in the dark with their son between them. Robert Lockhart Cooper was a loud, determined, cheerful baby who showed from the first weeks a combined stubbornness and fundamental good humor that people in town said was his mother and his father in equal measure. He had Lydia's brown eyes and Jonas's set jaw, and from the time he was old enough to be carried to the horse barn, he was entirely captivated by horses, which Lydia regarded as deeply satisfying and Jonas regarded as inevitable. The horse breeding operation had grown. By 1880, Lydia had 10 mares and a reputation that extended well beyond Calder County for the quality of her working stock. She had sold horses to ranchers in 3 counties and to 2 different cattle operations doing business along the Kishom Trail, and she had turned the Lockhart place into a proper horse ranch with a new barn, expanded pasture, and 2 additional hands she had hired herself, and paid herself from the proceeds of her business. Jonas had watched all of this with a pride that was entirely genuine and not uncomplicated by the fact that he had built his own operation from the same combination of stubbornness and vision, and that watching her do it gave him a pleasure that was different from and greater than anything he had felt in the doing of it himself. They argued occasionally. They were two people with strong opinions and direct habits of expression, and the kind of mutual respect that does not prevent disagreement. They argued about the cattle operation. Jonas had a tendency toward expansion that Lydia occasionally thought needed moderating. They argued about the horse breeding program. Lydia had ideas about bloodlines that Jonas did not always follow and occasionally pushed back on. They argued about land management, about water rights, about the right time to sell a calf versus the right time to hold it. These arguments were vigorous and specific and resolved, always, by a combination of logic and the particular willingness of two people who are genuinely committed to each other to listen, really listen, to the other's position. After one particularly spirited debate about pasture rotation, conducted in the yard of the Double C at sufficient volume that Sam the young cowboy had found urgent business to attend to at the far end of the property, Lydia had gone inside to start supper, and Jonas had leaned against the porch rail and realized he was smiling. Not the hard, difficult smile of the North Bluff or the wedding church, but the everyday kind, the quiet, constant background warmth of a man who has understood something important about his own life and has made his peace with it. He went inside and found Lydia at the stove and stood behind her and said, quietly, "You're right about the pasture rotation." She turned to look at him, because this was not a small concession, and her eyes were laughing. "I know I am," she said, with a complete absence of smugness that made it funnier than it would have been with smugness. "Will you set the table?" He set the table. In the spring of 1881, Lydia told Jonas she was expecting their second child. She told him across the same kitchen table with the same direct warmth, and this time the stillness before he responded was shorter. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Good," he said, and this time the word was different, not the overwhelmed, compressed good of the first time, but the easy, genuine, entirely happy good of a man who already knows what it means and is glad to be adding to it. Their daughter was born in October of 1881, small and already ferociously alert, with Lydia's chestnut hair and Jonas's gray eyes in an arresting combination. They named her Clara, for no particular family reason except that they had both looked at her and agreed independently that she was a Clara, which seemed like a sufficient reason. Robert, who was 2, regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way within a week to a possessive protectiveness that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their childhood. Mrs. Polly Briggs, who had watched Jonas Cooper for 7 years as a man who was building a very impressive thing in a very empty way, and who had watched Lydia arrive and quietly rewrite the narrative of the Double C without fanfare or force, attended Clara's birth with the focused assistance of a woman who takes these things seriously, and held the baby in the lamplight of the bedroom while Jonas and Lydia sat together on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at the small creature in Polly's arms with the specific, settled joy of people who are entirely where they mean to be. "She's a good weight," Polly said, with professional satisfaction. And then, because she could not help it, she added, "This house needed more people in it." "We know, Polly," Lydia said, with the smile of a woman who has been told a thing multiple times and does not mind hearing it again because it was always true. The autumn of 1881 settled into winter, and the Double C was, for the first time in its history, fully and properly warm, not in the physical sense, though the new fireplaces Lydia had insisted on made the limestone rooms considerably more comfortable than they had been, but in the sense that matters more than temperature. The long kitchen table had people at it. The study had 2 people's books on its shelf. The porch in the evening had 2 chairs where one had sat unused for years, and the survey map on the study wall had been joined by a framed drawing of a quarter horse that Lydia had made herself, and by a small painting of the North Bluff at dawn that a passing artist had done in exchange for a meal and a night's shelter, and which captured, with improbable accuracy, the way the light moved across the valley in the early morning. Jonas looked at that painting sometimes. He looked at it the way he used to look at his survey maps, as a record of something worth having, but the feeling was entirely different. By 1882, Clement Hadley's legal case had been fully resolved. He had received a 3-year sentence and had served it in the state prison, and had been released the previous spring, heading, reportedly, to Mexico and out of the territory entirely. Gerald Hatch had quietly retired from the county land office the previous year under circumstances that involved a county auditor and several missing records, and had not been replaced with anyone who shared his particular set of professional compromises. The land office was now run by a man named Barnes who was correct and thorough, and who had, on his first week in the job, made a point of verifying the title status of every parcel that had changed hands under his predecessor. He found 3 other cases with irregularities, none as clear-cut as the Lockhart situation, but all of which were resolved by the end of the year. Justice in the West was not always swift or certain, but it had moved in the right direction in Calder County, and that was worth acknowledging. Jonas Cooper's land holdings had not grown significantly since 1878. He had purchased 1 additional parcel in 1880, a small piece of bottomland that bordered the river and that he needed for water access. But the territorial hunger that had driven him for 20 years had quieted to something manageable the considered, proportional management of what he already had rather than the relentless forward march of accumulation. He noticed this change in himself and found he was not troubled by it. He understood now what the accumulation had been in place of, and he had the real thing. He rode his land differently, too. He had always ridden it well with knowledge and attention, but now he rode it with pleasure. He noticed things he had not noticed before, or had noticed and not cared about. The way the evening light fell on the limestone bluffs, the particular quality of the silence in the cedar breaks at midday, the places where the grass was especially rich and green after rain. He started telling Lydia about these things in the evenings, the specific observations of a man learning to pay attention to the world for its own sake rather than its utility. She listened to all of it with her full, warm attention, and occasionally wrote things down in her journal. "You could have been a naturalist," she told him once after he had described in more detail than he had intended the behavior of a pair of herons he had watched at the river bend for the better part of an afternoon. He looked at her. "I'm a rancher." "You're a rancher who was watching herons for 40 minutes when you were supposed to be checking the south pasture fence line." "The fence line was fine." "I know it was. I'm not criticizing. I'm saying you have a quality for observation that deserves better subjects than livestock occasionally." He thought about this. "Maybe," he said. And then, because she was watching him with that warm, perceptive expression, he said, "I never looked at things properly before. I looked at things to evaluate them, whether they were useful, whether they were worth having." He paused. "You changed that." She looked at him steadily. "How?" He thought for a moment, because he wanted to say this correctly, not because she required precision, but because it was true and he wanted to do it justice. "You look at everything like it's worth understanding," he said. "Not using, understanding, and it changed how I looked." She crossed the room and stood in front of him and took his face in her hands in the way she did when she wanted him to see that she was taking something seriously. "That quality was in you before I got here," she said. "I just made room for it." He put his hands over hers on his face and stood there in the warm lamplight of their shared study, and felt, for the uncountable time since she had arrived, the thing he had not been able to name for so long and which now he knew with certainty and ease. He was happy. Profoundly, specifically, genuinely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with what he owned and everything to do with who he was here in this house, in this life. The years that followed had the particular quality of years that are both full and peaceful, full in the way of a life that is actively lived, peaceful in the way of a life that is built on something real. The horse breeding operation continued to grow under Lydia's careful management, and by 1883, it had a regional reputation that brought buyers from as far as Abilene and Fort Worth. She had made 2 trips to San Angelo to inspect stallion prospects, both times with Jonas riding beside her, and the quality of her stock was evident in every foal born on the Lockhart place. Robert Cooper, at 4, was already spending every spare hour in the horse barn, where Lydia was teaching him with patient thoroughness the proper way to approach a horse, to read its posture, to establish trust. Jonas watched this and was reminded of nothing so much as himself at 22 on the first cattle drive, the young, alive, forward-looking brightness of a person beginning to understand what they love. He felt a deep, clean satisfaction in that, entirely different from the satisfaction of acquisition. This was the satisfaction of continuation, of passing something real forward. Clara Cooper, at 2, was conducting a systematic investigation of everything within her reach and several things that were technically beyond it, with the focused intelligence and physical confidence of a child who had been treated from birth as a person worth listening to. She had Jonas's directness and Lydia's warmth and her own particular quality that belonged entirely to herself, which was a complete absence of intimidation by anything or anyone, combined with an observant shrewdness that her father recognized, with amusement and some parental wariness, as very much his own. Polly Briggs, at 66, had announced the previous spring that she was ready to spend more time at her sister's home in San Marcos, now that the Double C had adequate management in the form of its mistress. She had made this announcement with the satisfied expression of a woman who has completed a significant project, and Lydia had hugged her with genuine warmth, and Jonas had shaken her hand, and then, in a departure that told Polly everything she needed to know about how much had changed in this house, put his arms around her and held her briefly and said, "Thank you for staying," in a voice that meant considerably more than the literal words. Polly had gone to San Marcos, and she wrote letters, and the letters were full of questions about the children and the horses and the ranch, and full of satisfaction. On a spring evening in 1883, 5 years after Lydia had ridden through the gate of the Double C for the first time with her traveling bag and her claim and her direct brown eyes, Jonas Cooper stood on the north bluff with his wife beside him and their son asleep on the blanket behind them, and the sound of the picos coming up from the valley below. It was the same bluff he had brought her to in that first spring, the same flat rock, the same wide valley. The light was the same amber and gold of late afternoon. Clara, who was 2, was not asleep. Clara was conducting a detailed examination of a lizard she had found in the rocks with the focused commitment of a child who will not be distracted from something interesting. "She's going to keep that lizard," Lydia said. "I know," Jonas said. "Are you bothered by that?" He looked at his daughter, who was carrying on a one-sided conversation with the lizard in the grave, instructive tones of someone delivering important information. "No," he said. Lydia leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, the easy, automatic movement of 2 people who have found the precise arrangement of each other and no longer have to think about how to fit. They looked at the valley below, at the river catching the late light, at the long sweep of grass and cedar brake that was the land he had spent 20 years acquiring. He thought, as he sometimes did in these reflective moments, about the man he had been before April of 1878, the methodical, sealed, efficient, impressive, empty man who had looked over this valley and felt nothing much in particular. He thought about 20 years of fence lines and surveys and deeds, and not a single morning of genuine gladness in any of it. He pulled Lydia slightly closer. "Are you thinking about something?" she said, because she knew that particular quality of his silence. "I'm thinking about how long I did this wrong," he said. She looked up at him. "You weren't doing it wrong. You were doing it incomplete." He looked at her. The light was doing what it had done 5 years ago, catching in her hair, and she was looking at him with those brown eyes that had always seen through him to whatever was actually true. And he thought, as he had thought in one form or another every day since September of 1878, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he was not going to let a day go past without knowing it. "Lydia," he said. "Jonas," she said, with the gentle amusement she reserved for the times he said her name as though he were confirming something. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said all true things, plainly, directly, without decoration, the whole weight of it in the words themselves. She put her hand against his chest, over his heart, in the particular gesture she had developed that was entirely theirs. "I love you," she said. "I have been loving you since you smiled at the fence line in April and didn't know what to do with it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close, the private, warm sound of a man who has been found out and doesn't mind. He pressed his lips to her temple. Clara, having reached a successful conclusion in her negotiation with the lizard, released it carefully and came to stand against her father's other side, pressing her small face against his arm. Robert stirred on the blanket and resettled without waking. The valley below held the last of the day's light. The river was bright. The land was quiet and green and entirely real, and it was full now in all the ways that mattered. Jonas Cooper had spent 20 years acquiring land, without a single day of genuine happiness in any of it. He had the surveys and the deeds and the cattle and the reputation, and he had stood at his highest fence line and felt, in the end, not very much at all. Then Lydia Lockhart had arrived in Dust Creek on an April morning with road dust on her dress and a leather traveling bag and a claim that was rightfully hers, and she had rearranged his priorities with the same quiet, capable, direct thoroughness that she brought to everything she did, not by asking him to be someone other than himself, but by showing him what himself could actually look like if he let it. The land was still there. All 14,000 acres of it, plus the Lockhart horse ranch beside it that was hers and was, by the most important definitions, his as well. The cattle were there. The limestone house was there. The fence lines he had spent 20 years building were exactly where they had always been, but they meant something different now. They were not the shape of a life. They were the setting for one. He stood on the bluff in the spring evening with his wife against his shoulder and his daughter leaning on his arm and his son sleeping in the last of the sunlight, and the whole wide valley was spread below them like a map of everything that mattered. And Jonas Cooper was, in a way that had nothing to do with land and everything to do with the woman beside him, entirely and completely home. And there, in that settled, golden, true and lasting gladness, he finally understood what happiness was. Not the absence of hardship, not the completion of an acquisition, not the reaching of a goal. But this ordinary, specific, living thing, a woman who had shown up when he wasn't looking and refused to let his silence swallow her, who had asked him honest questions and listened to the real answers, who had taken his hand at a fence line on a spring morning and changed the direction of everything. The sun went down over the ridge. The valley went from gold to lavender to the deep blue of early dark. Robert woke up and announced, with the directness of his father, that he was hungry. Clara already had Jonas's hand and was pulling him toward the horses. Lydia was laughing, the full, free laugh that was the sound he had come to love best in the world. They rode home together, the four of them, down the side of the bluff and across the good South Texas grass, toward the limestone house with its lit windows and the smell of supper on the air, and the double sea settled into the quiet of evening around them like a thing that had been waiting, all along, for exactly this. Jonas Cooper smiled. He had been doing it quite regularly now, and it suited him entirely.